Okay, we talked a little bit about the principles of the Constitution. Now we're going to talk about ways that we can amend it. Really, there is sort of two ways that this gets done. One is the formal process of amending, and you know that there are 26 amendments to the Constitution. So those 26 are formally done. The rest of the changes to the Constitution have been informal, different things that have occurred over time, and we'll go into details on each of those. And a lot of that is political maneuvering. A lot of it happens because of change in our society over time. But again, we're going to talk about both formal and informal amendments to the Constitution. So let's start with the process itself for amending. And again, this is in Article 5 of the Constitution. Article 5 is the one that sort of describes the process for doing this. Basically, you've got two ways to propose them and two ways to ratify them. And what I'm going to emphasize to you here is that the process for ratifying amendments, the process for putting amendments through into the Constitution is very much an example of federalism. And you really want to kind of grasp that concept here. And I'm going to give you a little subtle hint that that's definitely a quiz type question, because again, taking the process of federalism, you can see the application of it directly in this process. And what I mean is this. The amendments themselves are proposed at the federal level. And you can see there's two ways to do this. One is that there is a 2/3 vote of each house, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And if they get 2/3 of those people to agree to propose an amendment, it's done. Or we could have a national convention called by Congress that requests the states. Again, this has never occurred. Bottom line is, again, is both these are federal or kind of at the national level. So that's what we're talking about here in the proposal element. And then in the ratification process, now we kick down to the state level. And so again, you're seeing this example of federalism. You got some responsibilities that the federal government has, some responsibilities that the states governments have. And in this case, to ratify an amendment, legislatures in 3/4 of the states have to agree, or each state calls a ratifying convention and 3/4 of them must approve this amendment going through. And so you can see in this case that all except one amendment has been done by the top version, or the legislature's doing it. And then we had one, the 21st, which was done via the second way to ratify. 21st Amendment, of course, being the repeal of prohibition. So that's why that occurred, or well, it's not that's why, but ultimately that's the only amendment that hasn't followed that process. Again, emphasize you got the federal level at the proposal, or the federal government responsible for proposing, and then the state government's responsible for ratifying. Again, I mentioned this is in Article 5, and it's stated right here in this paragraph in your Constitution. Again, going back to our Constitution from the Americans Governing page, it's on here, and you can kind of read through it. There is some descriptions in here about the fact that the amendments can be made prior to a certain time, and that kind of thing. And a lot of it is talking about some of the suffrage that it gets in the Senate. In other words, you can't pass an amendment saying that you would change the number of representatives in the Senate. Otherwise, it talks about things you can change. And again, this is just written into Article 5 of the Constitution, and that way we can adapt and change. One amendment, there's been a few that have been proposed or at least talked about. One was an equal rights amendment for women. Basically, it would just be a written guarantee of rights for women so that they had equality. This has sort of lost a little bit of its luster as women have gained more, of a foothold, a stronghold in our society. Another has been the idea of not allowing people to burn the American flag. That has actually been somewhat of a hot topic, not so much now as it was maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. And then one of the things that's being talked about is having an amendment in which we have to balance our budget. That the government could not, we built an amendment in the Constitution that says we can't spend more than we take in, and that our legislative branch would be required to follow that guideline. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous in some respects. We have to have an amendment to do that, but sometimes they can't help themselves. So those are kind of things that are maybe current amendments that may be proposed, but you guys can see this is very difficult to do. Not only do you have to have 2/3 that federal legislative branch. But then you also have to have a lot of states that would agree. So that's a very difficult process for amending, and that's probably done on purpose. Again, more realistically, are informal changes that have been done to the Constitution. And again, some of these are just handled through cultural changes, or the change in our country, or the change in the way we believe about things. But they are somewhat important, and so we'll go through each of these. First and foremost is that much like, and again, I don't want to, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that we analyze the Constitution the way it's written as much as we do the Bible. But certainly, they're both studied very closely in that way. And certainly, if as you're going through your senior theology, especially when you get to the more comparative studies of the different religions, and especially the different forms of Christianity that are out there, a lot of them are based on how the Bible is interpreted. And is it interpreted very specifically, word for word? Or is it interpreted in more of a, well, this is sort of what they were talking about. God was generally referring to this. And so you have to sort of make that decision a little bit. In that case, it's more of a faith-based decision, or it's obviously a faith-based. But the Constitution has the same problem. And so sometimes people want to be very specific with the way the Constitution is written, and then other times people want to be a little bit more loose or open. And what's sort of an interesting irony here is that both political parties fall into this trap. The idea that maybe the Republicans feel that government should be out of our lives, and so the Constitution doesn't give the power to the government that our government has taken, and so they get upset about that. But then the Republicans also tend to get a little upset if people are heavily protesting or fighting for individual freedoms and rights, and so sometimes that becomes a struggle. Anyways, it's just sort of a random thing. Sometimes both parties use strict and loose when they feel like it's necessary, not necessarily always looking at it the same way. But again, those interpretations become a way to change the document. Congressional practice, and this is the concept of how much our legislative branch has changed. Sometimes the reality is that things are a little bit vague in their writing. For example, if we wanted to impeach a president, under impeachment, it talks about the idea that a federal officer would have to commit high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, what is a high crime and misdemeanor? What would we define that as? Misdemeanors are pretty minor. You could walk into 7-Eleven and grab a pack of gum off the shelf and walk out the door, and that's a misdemeanor. That's a minor violation. It's still theft, but is that enough to impeach a president? Well, I don't know. It's kind of open to interpretation, and that interpretation has allowed us to look at this very differently. We have 3 presidents that have been impeached, and you should probably write these down here. First one is, and the one we probably are least familiar with, that when we ask students questions, they generally answer with the other 2 first. But the first one's Andrew Johnson. He had gotten in trouble for manipulating some of the things that were going on in his cabinet and changing some of the rules that had gone on there in the Reconstruction time. And Andrew Johnson survived by 1 vote, was able to survive the impeachment hearings. So that's one. Again, he was basically, they were thinking that he was, again, manipulating or changing, and they almost considered it to be treason in regards to how he was conducting himself. Second one is Richard Nixon, and Nixon obviously ends up resigning through the impeachment process, probably because he was ultimately guilty of the Watergate scandal and being involved in some criminal activity that was carried out by some of his staff. Okay, so he resigns. And then the third one is Bill Clinton, and Clinton is perjury. I don't think there's no impeachment process for him having an affair or sexual relations inside the White House. There's no that's not a high crime or a misdemeanor, what people do in their private lives, but the fact that he lied under oath about it does make it a crime. And so that's where Bill Clinton got himself in trouble. However, Clinton also is not found guilty in the hearings, as far as the congressional thing. Now that it helps at that time that there was a lot of Democrats in that and in his political party in Congress at that time. And then ultimately, I think people sort of thought, again, it kind of goes back to this private element of not wanting to delve into his personal life. So again, but those are open to interpretation, and what the congresspersons at the time feel might be an impeachable offense. Presidential changes have occurred. The first is the idea of presidential succession. In the initial writing of the Constitution, it says that the vice president shall act as president if the president is killed or unable to uphold his office. Well, what does the term "act as" mean? Well, the first time this occurred, John Tyler takes over as president, and he just became the president. I mean, he just sort of walked into that office and decided, I'm the president. And so that's sort of how we worked it for a long time, that the president was just sort of established through practice as being the president. And from a VP standpoint, moving into that office. We sort of take that for granted, or we did. However, the 25th Amendment clarifies it, and it does very specifically state that if the president does die or is for some reason unfit to hold office, the 25th Amendment puts that president, the VP, into that position. We also have something about executive agreements and treaties. I think I had referenced in the constitutional principles lecture the idea that a treaty must be approved by the Senate. Well, presidents have loosely gotten around that with something called executive agreements. And executive agreements are basically arrangements that are made with other political leaders that are designed to circumvent that need to have a treaty signed. So they'll make an executive agreement with another country, and it has so far, our country has followed those as if they're rule of law, and they've never proved to be unconstitutional, but the Senate doesn't need to approve them. So again, a little bit of that is the president working above and beyond what is really written into the Constitution. Again, for the most part, we take those for granted. We haven't had a big deal. There hasn't been a problem. But again, it is sort of circumventing the system a little bit. And again, presidents in both parties and over a long period of time have used that process of executive agreements. Well, domestic affairs is a great example of how the president can start to initiate or have a role in legislative agenda. As you know, and I mentioned this again in the Principles of the Constitution lecture, but the legislative branch's job is to make law. And also, by the way, to make the budget. However, the president's job is to execute it. And so, really, there should be no role for the executive office in the legislative branch. However, what's occurred is that the president runs on specific ideas, things that, ideals, or maybe a platform of concepts or ideas that he wants to put forth. And so the best presidents have been able to use their power to initiate new law or to initiate programs and the way things are funded in the legislative branch. And the best presidents, the ones that we really maybe look back on historically and say, that person did a pretty good job, are the ones that were able to do this the best. And again, I think there's examples in both parties. Ronald Reagan was exceptional at this. He was a unbelievably popular president, was really able to utilize the American public to put pressure on the legislative branch to get things accomplished that he wanted accomplished. And I will point out that for the most part, when he was in office, the legislative branch was primarily Democrat. And so he was fighting across party lines because Reagan is certainly a Republican. And so we have to give Reagan a lot of credit for some of the initiatives he was able to get through. And a lot of it was him using his political power and negotiating skills. And frankly, his staff was excellent at working with the other side. And so President Reagan certainly well known for some of the things that he was able to accomplish. The other one, again, to give you an example, again, also pretty recent, and of the other party, is Bill Clinton. Clinton managed to run our government in the black. In other words, we ran a budget that actually we ended up with more money at the end of the year than what we started with. And again, that has not happened in our current presidencies. And again, same thing. President Clinton was working against a Republican legislative branch. And so, he had to find ways to negotiate. And what President Clinton did was used his influence of negotiation and, frankly, finding some compromise. And quite often that compromise and them sort of working through those issues really allowed for there to be some success. Now, as I'm recording this particular lecture, it's in the summer that I'm doing it, and whether you've been aware in the news or not, but we've been fighting this debt ceiling idea and this whole issue with budgets, and the parties are really, Barack Obama and the leadership and the legislative branch are really struggling, and it's sort of ironic that they can't work this out. Bill Clinton was able to work through this, and again, we'll kind of see how this shakes out, and frankly, it'll probably be what decides whether or not President Obama will get reelected. So it's kind of an interesting thing that's going on now as we look back on previous presidents. But presidential influence certainly helpful in getting things done. The next area that's somewhat unique is this idea of court decisions. And certainly we talked about judicial review as being a principle of the Constitution, but the idea that the federal Supreme Court can change law to make sure it matches the requirements of the Constitution. So that role in judicial review can significantly impact how that is handled. There's sort of two ways to look at this, and judges have shown both examples of these, but one is this idea of judicial restraint, which is for the most part that the judges would stay out of social issues as best they can. And this could be everything from civil rights to privacy rights to anything like that basically they would try and avoid making society decisions in their court cases. In other words, they wouldn't let society impact their decision. They would purely look at the law. Other judges feel like it's their chance to sort of some people would say legislate from the bench. And again, this is the concept that we saw in California, although it was the California Supreme Court, not the federal court, with regards to gay marriage. And it was a court that basically ruled one of the laws about gay marriage that was passed unconstitutional, at least according to the California Constitution. And so that actively taking a role in those kind of decisions is just another way that judges can look at this. And you'll see judges on both sides of this particular argument. What's amazing about court decisions is that the rulings themselves can change over time. And I think the best example is to go through sort of the civil rights cases. And I'm going to give you three here. You're going to want to get them down because they're sort of interesting as you look at it. The first case is Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson, excuse me, I'm using the wrong one. The first case I'm going to talk about is Dred Scott. Sorry, I skipped the case there. But Dred Scott case, you may remember from history class, but it's in the early 1860s, and a particular slave escaped up into the north. And some of these guys, remember, would come hunt slaves, and they rounded up Dred Scott and took him into court, and basically this Dred Scott sued, saying that, hey, look, I'd escaped, I was free, I was in the free state, you can't come collect me from there. And the Supreme Court ruled in the 1860s that Dred Scott was property, that because he was a slave, that he was just a piece of property, much like, in fact, they even compared him in their comments to that of a horse. The slave is much like a horse. It's the property of the person who owns it. Now, the Dred Scott case is before the Civil Rights Amendments. It's before the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But that was the decision the Supreme Court made, was that slaves were the same as horses, that they were property, okay? We advance forward a little bit to Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the case I was referring to before. And Plessy versus Ferguson's case in the early 1900s, again, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Civil Rights Amendments. And in Plessy versus Ferguson, they ruled that it was okay for societies or people to have a separate facilities for different races. So you could have a water fountain, a bathroom, a public park, whatever it was, where you could, or school for that matter, that was all white or all black, and the only that was okay, that you couldn't have these things as long as they were both made available. Well, you guys know where that went. The southern states made separate things, but they weren't the same, right? The schools weren't as good. The water fountains and the places, the black people could go were not equal. And so that led to another court case, which was the Brown versus Board of Education case, which many of you, again, have heard. And the Brown versus Board of Education case basically took Plessy versus Ferguson, 30 years later, and said, no, this is not okay. That separate but equal is inherently unequal. That you can't have separate items for blacks and whites. That idea in and of itself is an example of racism or a function of non-equal civil rights, and so they ruled differently. So you can see that just those three types of cases, albeit one was prior to some new amendments to the Constitution, but even in those kind of decisions, things change. And this happens in every walk of life in regards to privacy, freedom of speech, as we've talked about the issues with religion and establishing religion. All these things change as the court changes and adapts. So court changes change the Constitution. Customs and usage, political parties. Again, we haven't talked about it too much, at least in lecture form. We'll talk about it in class at times, but the political parties themselves were not supposed to exist. The Constitution doesn't refer to them in any way, shape, or form. The Founding Fathers didn't want political parties. However, they play a pretty significant role in our legislative branch in particular, but in all of our branches of government. Again, the Supreme Court justices should be a little bit clear of that, but they're all over the place, and we know the roles they have are relatively significant, and so that becomes a little bit problematic. But there was nothing about them that was supposed to be included. Cabinet positions. The Constitution refers to 4. We have 15 now. And so, a lot of that has to do with just our society changing. I don't think we needed a Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, in the 1800s. We just didn't have those issues. Now we do. So we've got to deal with that. Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security is there now. So Postmaster General. These are things that we didn't really need. But over time, we've needed to have new elements to the federal government as our bureaucracy has grown and our country has grown. So that kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that we've had to amend the Constitution, both formally and informally. And, again, this is one of those elements that's just the way that our Constitution is able to adapt has become a very, very important piece to the way our country has been able to survive under its current Constitution.